Tak, dobrý večer všem do úplně všech bublin, ze kterých nás sledujete. Vítáme vás u dalšího streamu jménem HateFree Talk. Moje jméno je Jirka Pasz, hostem dnes bude vědkyně a expertka na německý pravicový extremismus Sophií Schmalenberger. Sofie dokončuje PhD na univerzitě v dánském Aarhusu, kde se věnuje právě extremismu. Přispívá do médií a mimo jiné také spolu vytváří Banana Populism blog. Ale taky má ráda lišky, miluje finskou saunu a je velkou faninkou seriálu Twin Peaks. Dneska se budeme bavit o tom, co vlastně považujeme za extremismus a co ne. Jestli je pravicový extremismus v Německu na vzestupu a jak se to projevuje. Ale taky o tom, jak je možné s extremismem bojovat tak, aby se neopakovaly tragické události minulosti. Dnešní HateFree Talk bude v angličtině. Pokud vy chcete položit nějaký dotaz, klidně ji napište česky do komentáře pod stream. Hi Sophie, greetings to Berlin.
Hello.
How are you tonight?
Good. Very happy to be here.
Okay, so let's begin right away. How do we define extremism? How can we actually divide extreme and not extreme in terms of, for example, content, behavior, agenda, etc.?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the most common definition, both in research or an academic world, I would say, but also sort of in a security agency world, is that extremism usually is defined as any movement or group that rejects liberal democratic constitution as sort of the foundation for our state and for our societies, and sort of wants to replace democracy with a different form of governance. Usually, it would be some sort of dictatorship, for example. And then the second, thing we could maybe say about extremism is that often these aims, these political aims, are people are ready to use violence in order to achieve them. So they would directly or indirectly encourage people who feel that they belong to this group or agree with this ideology to commit acts of violence in order to achieve those political aims, for example, acts of terrorism. And what we usually see as like not necessarily extreme, for example, not extreme, like a party that is far right, but not extreme right, for example, is a party that would generally agree with the democratic system, with the idea of parliamentary representation and democratic presentation, and with the system of elections, for example, to determine who should be sitting in parliament. But of course, it's sometimes very, the lines between both are blurry. We often have sort of not explicitly extremist far-right parties also telling stories or having sort of propaganda material that is maybe not directly inciting violence, but that is maybe a first step, let's say, in an extremization process, that you sort of agree with the messages of a far-right party that not necessarily tells you that you should go on the streets and commit violent acts, but it can be sort of a first step on the way to a more extreme political standpoint.
Does extremism change a lot during time, or is it more or less very similar?
Well, I mean, of course, it changes the way everything changes when we move towards different points in history. And of course, for example, also the means by which it is spread change. I mean, we have extremism in a sense is also very good in using, for example, the media environment it is embedded in. So, I mean, we had, for example, the Nazis and Adolf Hitler using the first radios in order to spread their propaganda, and now we have the internet where far-right extremists are very, very, unfortunately, very, very good and very, very sort of innovative in using the internet for spreading their messages. So, and then of course we also have different historical, let's say, events that can function as as a certain reference point for far right or for extremist messages. So, for example, I mean, with the Nazis, it would be the Treaty of Versailles or the financial crisis in the 1920s, and today it would be the influx of refugees and migrants into Europe, for example, or in the early 2000s, it would be Islamic terrorism, for example. So, in that sense, the form and also, in a sense, the content changes, but usually, especially if we talk about far-right extremism, the core, which is basically dehumanizing others, usually defined as sort of racialized others, as people that look different from us, is often, or is usually, the same. We just see it appear in different forms over time.
You have already mentioned historical experience. Why do people become extremists now?
Yeah, I mean, that's of course the $100,000 or $1 million or euro or whatever currency question. That also a lot of people working on at the moment. How do we understand sort of extremization processes? And I mean, I cannot give you a definite answer. I can only bring up some things that play a role. And since I'm not a psychologist by training, I cannot really talk about, the internal things going on in somebody's head, whether there is, something on a personal level, maybe some, psychological disorders that make some people more likely than others to become extremists. So I can more talk about societal issues or the world people grow up in and live in and then become extremists. And there I think, see that often, in insecurities play a big role, or an instability in one sense or the other. So people feel like they are losing something. Maybe they feel maybe they have lost something. Maybe they have lost their jobs, or they feel that they don't properly understand the world around them anymore because so much has changed. And we see the far-right extremist groups taking a lot of advantage of that, especially in the internet. And what we see there is that far-right extremist groups sort of offer people, maybe you could say a solution or a simple truth that does not only solve the problem of people, but also offers them a stable identity in a way, something they can be proud of. So, for example, if we talk about far-right extremism, if you address a person that has maybe just lost his or her job and just doesn't know how to make ends meet anymore, and also feels a bit, a bit useless maybe in a society where he or she cannot even have a job. And we see that a lot in some parts of Eastern Germany, for example, or in some other regions in Germany that are maybe what you could call socially disprivileged, where there is very few jobs and a very weak social infrastructure, where they come in and offer them meeting points, and they offer them places where they can be and where they can, get new clothes, or where the kids go and can do their homework or can get help with their homework. But what they also offer them is a stable identity, in that sense that they tell them, oh well, it's fine if you don't have a job. You're still a good, or you're still a superior person because you're German, because you're white, because you're better than all the others. And I think we see a lot that this the destabilizing of sort of maybe social identities in a way, or social political identities, in some people opens a void where then a far-right ethno-nationalist identity can step in and offer people a new way of thinking about themselves, but also, of course, offer them, in a sense, a group where they belong, where they are where they are liked, where they are welcomed, where they can be in exchange with other people. And especially also where they, how can you say, where they are not really challenged with maybe their racist views. So maybe if they talk to their old friends or something, or their family, they are maybe challenged and being told, you cannot talk something like this. This is racist, or this is anti-Semitic, or whatever. But they then meet a group where they're just completely accepted, and where they maybe even sort of re-encouraged in ways they've been thinking, and get caught in these what we also call echo chambers, where where your opinion just gets more extreme and extreme because it's always repeated in a sense, and you always reconfirmed that that you're being tricked by the government, or that the migrants come and take all your jobs or something. And if you're in this sort of filter bubble, especially on your social media, and you just see this, you see another news report or fake news report saying it and reconfirming it, you're getting more and more convinced, and that then at that point you might be sort of very convinced that you're the victim of something, that the government is against you, or the migrants are against you, I don't know, the police is against you, or whoever, all the lefties are against you. I mean, different sort of enemies that are constructed within these bubbles. And then it is, if you feel that you're the victim of something, it's not very, it's the next step would be to fight back, right? To think that all the unjust things that have been done to you justify that you now can on the other hand, I think I've talked a lot about the extremists now, and the people who sometimes become perpetrators. And even though I think we have to understand these individual processes that are going on, we also have to remember that we should also focus on the victims, and show solidarity with the victims, because in the end, the people who become extremists are still the ones who commit violence against somebody. They are the ones who become a threat against somebody, and we, I think, as a society, have to show unquestioned solidarity with all the people that are being threatened by these people, who can become potential victims of these people, and we have to listen to them, and our states, or our the countries that we live in, and the security structures that we live in, need to protect these people. So that's also a very important thing, that sometimes just looking at the perpetrators, we are almost, or we're forgetting maybe.
Let's make sure we never forget the victims, as you say. Thank you for answering this very difficult question. So it seems like it's always a combination of factors, and we should strive to prevent them. But let's take a look at Germany now.
Mm-hmm.
What is happening in Germany? Is far-right extremism on the rise?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, Germany at the moment has the very negative first place of being the leading country in Western Europe when it comes to far-right violence, or acts of far-right violence in Western Europe. So since 2019, for example, 35 people, in 2019, so 2 years ago, that's the latest statistics we have, 35 people have died because of far-right violent acts in one way or the other. And since 1990, at least 121 people have been killed in acts of far-right violence in the Federal Republic of Germany. The number is probably higher, So that's the ones where it's 100% sort of acknowledged that this was far-right violence. There's a lot of sort of incidents where the police has not 100% classified something as a political act of violence, for example. And also, just from the years 2018 to 2019, the German Office for the Protection of the Constitution has registered an increase in, what they call far-right extremist potential in Germany. So at the moment, they are counting 32,000 or around 32,000 people who are showing a potential danger, let's say, compared to 24,000 in the year 2018. And also the number of criminal acts. So that can be violence, but that can also be, like destroying the window of a mosque or something. That can also be like vandalism, for example, or like sending threats to somebody because of his or her religion or ethnicity. And they have been increasing by 10% as well from the year 2018 to 2019. So it's not only, let's say that it has become a topic that's more visible in the media in the last 2 to 3 years, but also the numbers just show that actually, there has been some sort of radicalization in society.
So we have some numbers proving that radicalization and extremism is actually on the rise. I think some of the people watching us might be also interested if we have any numbers about the, let's say, extreme leftist violence and Islamic and violence connected to Islamic terrorism. Do we have those numbers?
I mean, first of all, I don't have them here or in my head or on my notes, but they are lower than far right violence. There's 0 victims, 0 people died of far right violence since the 90s.
You mean left?
Sorry, far left or left wing
Sure.
extremism. So I mean, of course, there's violent acts there too, but they would usually not go against a human being. They would, burning a car, which of course is also not right, but they don't attack humans as such. And I think that's one of the major differences between both political sides, so to say, even though, of course, I think there's a lot of problems in equating or trying to equate both sides of the political spectrum. The same with Islamic terrorism. I mean, or Islamic violence. I don't have the exact numbers, but they are far lower than right-wing violence numbers. The same, by the way, with anti-Semitic crimes. It's by the vast majority is committed by far-right extremists in that category.
So you are saying that we should be concerned by far the most about far-right extremism in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the numbers, that's the main threat to German society at the moment is the far right, and particularly those extremists that are sort of ready to use violence against other human beings.
I think we can state that Germany has catastrophic historical experience with far-right extremism and radical form of society. It is also well known that the country is doing a lot to prevent extremism and these things from happening again. Can you share your personal experience growing up in Germany? How does it actually happen? What do kids and people in general go through to prevent extremism?
Yeah, I mean, we have a broad, like, structure of remembrance in a sense. I mean, from a lot of what you call the places of commemoration, monuments, museums, of course, also the concentration camps that are made into places of remembrance. And we have, of course, our politicians reiterating memories of the Nazi past and of the Holocaust in I mean, almost any major speech they are giving. So it's sort of a very vast structure, the thing that usually you come to meet as a child or as a growing up in Germany is, of course, that you would usually go with your school, maybe not necessarily to a concentration camp, but to some sort of a place of remembrance or a museum that shows you things about that time. You would also, of course, have it a lot in your history lessons. I think we talked about the Second World War and Nazi Germany for at least 2 years in total, like throughout your school. I mean, you talk about it at some point in 5th grade, for example, and then you talk about it again. And we would also have, I remember when I was in school, we had this, there's this network of schools that you can become a part of called School Without Racism. And it's sort of a network of schools that have, committed themselves to prevent racism and discrimination happening in their schools, which is, of course, a good thing. But of course, that doesn't mean that racism and discrimination doesn't happen. I mean, just because you have this title is, of course, when I think back about being in school, there was still a lot of exclusion and racism and stereotyping going on that I maybe did not realize at the time, because I mean, I wasn't the one being a victim of that, right? But when I think back today and look back at my teenage years, there's a lot of things that I think were very problematic. And I think it has to do partly with the fact that when we are taught these things in schools, it's sort of treated as a historical thing. It's not. It's very far away in a sense from us. It's a bit treated like, you have to learn all the dates and these kind of stuff. And it's, I think, I sometimes have this memory of, we had this one time witness, as we call them, this one old Jewish man who was a child in Nazi Germany, coming into class. And I think this was the first time I understood like the magnitude and the terror of what had happened, because I had a man there who had been experiencing this. And I think a general problem here is that we, how should you say, you remember or you learn about a collective guilt in the schools, but what you learn very little about, and what has also not happened a lot in German society, is to sort of start investigate where it gets personal for you, and that is to start to, ask or wonder at least about what have your parents done, or maybe not parents now anymore, but for me, okay, my grandparents are slightly too young, but like my grandparents' parents, for example. So what in your family is the legacy of this? Like we have, for example, I don't know the exact numbers, but we have like 3/4 of the German society about that number would say that their grandparents were not perpetrators, or their grandparents or whatever. So we have this weird, how should you say, disconnect between learning about it in school, but on an individual level, still thinking that our families were not, like, oh, but not my grandparent, or, oh, my grandfather, maybe he drove a truck, but he wasn't in the SS. So we have this weird disconnect. And I think that is because we always just remember this sort of weird collective guilt, which is removed from a personal level. And we also, we remember it also as how should you say, as a thing that we have overcome, in a sense. So the phenomenon, what actually happened, gets a bit vague in remembering of how we have become better than this. And I think a third problem is also that we, remembering how great we were in overcoming Nazi Germany, we forget two things, and it's the first one being that there is continuities between Nazi Germany and the Federal Republic, and also the GDR, of course, but that a lot of people were not put into prison. Not everybody was at the Nuremberg trials. A lot of people were Nazis, and 3 years later they were, again sitting in an office somewhere in the city administration in a Western German city. So there was, and of course, I mean, they didn't change their mind they didn't suddenly have a new, worldview in them, of course. But also I think we are too little concerned with what you could call coming to terms with our present. So the fact that today we have racism in Germany, we have, I mean, as I just mentioned, far-right violence against people who are read as having some sort of migration history, and who are not considered to completely belong with the German nation. And I think being so occupied with the past and being so proud of how well we remember the past all the time has prevented society at large in Germany from realizing that we have a problem today. Mm-hmm. If I mean, that's maybe very sort of provocative to say, but I think that's what it is to some degree.
Thank you for what you've been saying. I think we could definitely find some similarities between Germany and Czech in sense of the communist regime in mm-hmm. Czechoslovakia and the ability or inability to cope with the past and to deal with it. But you already mentioned it. Let's talk a little bit about the examples. Mm-hmm. You do have a problem in Germany today as well. There is a problem with far-right extremism in many other countries, as we've seen in the United States right now.
Yeah.
More recently. Can you give us some examples of some things that happened in the past years regarding the far-right extremism?
Yeah, I mean, I think here we can maybe distinguish between two main, how should you say, groups or versions of the far right, if you will. So it's on the one hand, what you could maybe call the classic neo-Nazis. I mean, the people we all have in mind, with the bald head and big boots and jackets, maybe being a bit fat and like having some swastika tattoos and this kind of things, and those groups who would see themselves as sort of as being in line with Hitler and the Nazis. So who would have also Mein Kampf standing at home, and who would have an ideology that's more or less taken 100% from the Nazis. And here we had the National Socialist Underground in the early 2000s, which was a terror, like a little, not little, but it was 3 people. So in that sense, it was small, but it was 2 guys, Uwe Böhnhardt and Uwe Mundlos, and a woman called Beate Zschäpe, who went underground and sort of were hiding with some of their Nazi friends and planned attacks against people who they thought did not belong to Germany, mainly people who were first or second generation migrants from Turkey or Greece. And they didn't only plan these attacks, but they also committed them. So between the years 2000 and 2007, they killed 10 people. One of them was a policewoman they killed in one of these attacks. But 9 of them were of Turkish, and I think it was 7 were of Turkish and 2 of Greek origin. So mostly Turkish Germans, or Germans with a Turkish family background. And they also hurt 22 people in a nail bomb attack in the city of Cologne. And that was also in a Turkish, or like a neighborhood where a lot of Turkish Germans lived. So also here clearly, the aim was not white, blonde, blue-eyed Germans, obviously. And the actual scandal was that the police, because they did this in different federal states, so they traveled throughout Germany and did these attacks. And these attacks were never connected. So they would happen, for example, like half a year between them. And since we have, because of a federal structure, we have some police. We have a police in Bavaria, and we have a police in Berlin, for example, and they wouldn't necessarily talk to each other a lot. But another problem, besides this sort of structural one, was that the police themselves thought it must be some sort of drug thing. It must be some sort of criminal activity these people have been involved in. So these classic stereotypes you have against a guy. It was mostly guys who had like shops or restaurants. So the police was really coming to the families and, telling them, your father was dealing drugs, now tell us what you know so we can find the murderer, and things like this. And even when there was clear sort of witnesses that said, oh no, they saw this white woman with a bike in front of the shop or something before the bomb exploded, nobody was following sort of the lead that this might be a racist motive. And they actually were only discovered after they tried to rob a bank and the police chased them. And then, the 2 guys, Uwe Böhnhardt and Uwe Mundlos, blew themselves up in their camping van. So only the woman, Beate Zschäpe, survived and was sentenced in 2018 for life in prison. But also during this process, there's a lot of things that just didn't, that couldn't be solved. Like a lot of, there's partly a question whether the secret, like some German agencies, is like the Federal Office for the Protection of the Investigation was involved somehow, because they have the system of having contacts to people in the far right scene that they use as informants. So there was this idea that these 3 terrorists had been having contact with some of the informants of the federal agency, and so there's a lot of these questions that are just remaining open. There's a lot of questions: where did they get all their weapons from, or who else did they get support from? So in the end, this process, even though the main still living perpetrator was sentenced, the victims the families of the victims felt very left alone, because they still have so many questions about how this could happen. And then we have the murder of Walter Lübcke, a politician in the state of Hessen in Germany. I don't think there's any other English name, Hessen. A Christian Democrat politician who was very strongly for an open society, and who basically told people, or who had sort of a famous quote that was along the lines of, well, if you don't want to welcome diversity and other people in this country, then, well, I guess you have to leave this country, which he basically said to far-right extremists. And he was shot on the terrace of his home in the city of Kassel in 2019 by a far-right extremist who was also sort of networked within sort of the classic neo-Nazi far-right scene, and who is right now they just had the final pledges today in court, so he's probably being sentenced for life in prison as well. But also here, there's a lot of things unclear, where how did he get support from somebody, and was it really only him, or was it a broader network who did this? So that's two examples of sort of the classic neo-Nazi actors, let's say. And then we have something that is, a bit more recent, with the primary examples, of course, Anders Breivik in Norway, and the shooting in Christchurch, the so-called lone wolf terrorists, people who are not part of a scene necessarily, who are, alone, even though they are not really alone, because they are being radicalized on the internet. They are in exchange with far-right extremists online, usually in some so-called forums or boards where they can talk with people who think like them. And here we had the terrorist attack in the city of Halle in October 29. Where far-right gunmen tried to enter a mosque, not a mosque, sorry, synagogue, on Yom Kippur, the biggest Jewish sort of holiday, and the synagogue was full of praying Jews, and he was heavily armed with sort of 3D printed weapons, and the only thing that saved these people was that the door of the synagogue was so thick, was a wooden door, and was so thick that he couldn't get through it. Otherwise, we probably would have seen something similar to what happened in Christchurch. And then he went on and was frustrated and shot two white people on the street. With him, it was very clear that he had been radicalized in the internet because he wrote a manifesto that was that had a lot of sort of game elements and a lot of these slang words that are used on image boards like 4chan or 8chan. So a lot of this sort of troll culture, a lot of internet culture could be found in there. And he also gave in his manifesto, he wrote like a manual on, or like a game rules, as if his terror attack was a game. He also had a live stream, like a head camera to live stream his attack. So that was one of these sort of terrorists, far-right terrorists being radicalized on the internet. The second one being the one in Hanau, less than a year ago, in February 2020. Who shot 9 people in shisha bars in the city of Hanau, in 2 different shisha bars. So also here, sort of the aim was clearly to kill people that in his worldview did not belong, because they looked differently, or they had some sort of family background in other countries. But when we talk about these terrorists, we often have this tendency, or the media has a tendency, to talk about them as the lone wolves, people who just one day decide that now I'll take a gun and I shoot people. But what it is in reality is what you could call stochastic terrorism. So you have a very, very extreme places in the internet where you have a lot of hate speech, and where you have a lot of dehumanizing, racialized others, for example, or of course you also have a lot of anti-Semitism in there. And so the idea is that you don't tell somebody specifically to commit an act like this, but at some point, if there's 1,000 people in there, the probability that one of them will grab a gun and shoot people at some point is just very high if they are constantly exposed to these hateful messages and dehumanizing messages.
let's get back to the internet and online radicalization very soon. You have mentioned something that I think is a very disturbing phenomenon, and let me ask a question about that. What about the radicalization and extremism in Germany in state authorities such as police and army? That is disturbing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is very frightening. I mean, if you trust your security forces to be there to protect all citizens and everybody living in Germany, actually, I mean, no matter if he or she is a citizen or refugee or an asylum seeker or whatever. But unfortunately, far-right extremism and ideology is also to be found among security agencies in Germany. So, I mean, we have different examples. We have we have a lot of chat groups. I mean, as stupid as it sounds, but like there's a lot of WhatsApp groups where sort of far-right material is shared from memes dehumanizing racialized others to actual, I mean, Hitler pictures and stuff like this. So I mean, it's not only like somebody making a bad racist joke. Yeah, it's really extremist stuff. It's not just your uncle saying something that is racist. But we also have unfortunately people in the German military, cases of far-right extremism in there, where, for example, the KSK, which is sort of, I mean, it's a very elite unit within the Bundeswehr, within the German military. I mean, they really, train for very special tasks. And there we had, I think, 20 people who had who were under the suspicion of having far-right ideologies, and where it was often said that, for example, the role of this elite group, of this being, how should you say, in this very sort of I mean, they are among themselves a lot, and they get this idea of being very elite, of being very, the best of the best, so that and of course they also have to have this very strong team, in a sense, and that it can easily maybe get a bit out of hand, to think, you are also like superior because you're white or something like this. And of course it's a very closed circle, so what you say in there, you might develop this secrecy. We also have cases where it can be proven that data was sort of private addresses were searched on a police computer, and these data was used to send threatening, like, emails or threatening letters to a broad group of like journalists and politicians and also sort of other artists in Germany. And all these letters were signed by the NSU 2.0, and the NSU, as I said before, is this terrorist cell I was just speaking of. So these data were acquired through police computers, and unfortunately, what we also see is a lack of will to investigate these things. It's often handled as an internal police matter, but then you become this, other policemen and women, trying to figure out what other police women or men did. So it becomes this internal thing. There's a lot of this comradeship, and you don't want to badmouth a colleague and stuff like this. So there's simply a lack of transparency, but also a lack of sort of an agency that can actually find out what has been going on here. And we also have a SEK, which is sort of the German SWAT team, maybe. So the heavily armed people who come in when it's really serious. who was part of a far-right organization that has actually been established by police and former military members, and he was storing ammunition illegally in his backyard. So we have this prepper scene, as it's usually called, these people who just store a lot of guns and munition and sort of think the revolution is going to start soon and we're going to be a part of it. And so actually people who arm themselves heavily. So I mean, I could go on for like hours because there's so many cases appearing in the last couple of years.
That's very disturbing indeed. I would like just to add that according to what I found in terms of the case that you were describing with the KSK special unit, I think it's good to mention that the police are looking into disappearance of 48,000 ammunition rounds, and more than 62 kilograms of explosives missing from that unit. So I think whenever 62 kilograms of explosives go missing, it's extremely serious in terms of possible damage. So let's go back to the internet and online radicalization, because if I'm correct, we can see that internet plays a very important role in people becoming radical.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially, I mean, I think we can see it with these Corona protests very well. I mean, that it's doing ever more so for the last 10 months, where we couldn't really go anywhere. I mean, if you were like a local neo-Nazi group in the last 10 months, you couldn't really recruit new people, right? Because people were not allowed to go out, maybe for a while in summer. But so of course people also spend more time on the internet. So I think what you see very well with this Corona conspiracy theories and QAnon and whatnot, that I think it's also on the rise because people just get trapped in these filter bubbles. I mean, the algorithms of YouTube, for example, work in a way that if you watch one video, I mean, you get the next one that's sort of about a similar topic. And what we often see with far-right contents and also with QAnon is that you have an algorithm that gives you more and more extreme, because then you watch the next video and then the algorithm thinks, Sophie, she really likes that kind of thing, so I'm going to show her more of that and more of that and more of that. So we also actually have some structural things about the internet that make radicalization more likely, at least, because once you are in something, you will be shown more of the same content. So again, you will not be forced sort of to question your opinions or your beliefs, or they won't be challenged anymore at some point. And I mean, I think, just speaking for myself, I do think I've spent much more time on the internet in the last year than I normally would have. So we see it here, but I mean also before, of course, the internet has played a big role, simply because you can, I mean, like it's the case for any company or anyone, you can reach so many people with just one tweet. Potentially you could reach millions of people, right? Which of course is not the case if you have a flyer that you distribute on the marketplace somewhere. So that's of course one thing. We also have, until recently, had very, very little regulation, in a sense, especially on social media platform, on what counts as hate speech and what not, and what does maybe count as hate speech, but it's not really deleted, even if it clearly is hate speech. So very sort of free infrastructure that the far right could just use. And I think, especially when we talk about what what you could maybe call or what we call the new right. So that is people who are not neo-Nazis. So they don't celebrate Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. They would ideologically distance themselves from the Nazis, but they would talk more about sort of they would culturalize the sort of the xenophobia. So they would just say, we want to protect our European culture because it's so great. And Muslims can go and have their culture somewhere. So that they call it ethno-pluralism. So like different ethno-cultural entities, like the Europeans or the Germans should be in one place, but they should be free of any foreign elements because they can be in their places. Yeah. So they try to rephrase race. It's not really a theory because there is no races, right? But let's say just race theory that Adolf Hitler used. And they are, unfortunately, young and smart. Or at least they know how to use social media. The image of the a bit dumb neo-Nazi that's hanging out somewhere in a bar and having a bit too many beers. That's not unfortunately, but that's not necessarily how far-right messages are presented anymore, and that's not necessarily anymore how the far-right presents itself. We have the identitarian movement, for example, who are, sometimes called the Nazi hipsters because they have this very sort of young, cool aesthetics. They make videos where they have some music there and some, everything looks like it could be from an Instagram influencer. Yeah. So it's very hard to detect in a sense, and it sort of covers up the extremism of their messages as well.
Maybe we can, sorry to interrupt you, maybe we can focus a little bit on that, because it seems that according to some statistics, up to 80% of radicalizations happens online. And there are some groups that are more vulnerable to that content. And I'm talking about kids and teenagers. You have mentioned that there are a lot of ways. Social networks, groups such as WhatsApp groups, algorithms of different platforms such as YouTube. So there is a lot of possibility. There is a high possibility of your kids, being subjected to such propaganda. Are there any examples of successful interventions? Can parents do anything to prevent their kids from becoming extremists?
Again, a $1 million question. I think, the first thing here is just to, of course, it depends also a bit on your general, how you bring up your child's style. So, but a general thing is, I think, to consider the internet as the same as you consider the city or the playground. So of course also a bit depending on how old your child is, but ask your kids when your kid would go to the city or out, you would probably usually ask in the evening, so where have you been, right? And whom did you meet, and what did you do? Did you meet this friend or this friend? So I think this could maybe be a first step. Just be aware that they are also going places. They are not just watching funny videos. And this is, of course, any sort of content that is not really meant for them. Be it far-right content, be it sort of Islamic terrorist recruitment, be it sort of sexual things they should not be seeing, or be it, just some other sort of manipulative content, yeah. So I think, just maybe try to normalize a conversation about what they're seeing, not necessarily controlling. I don't think kids are smart. And I don't think controlling, I mean, you know, like, I think you cannot really block the websites as fast as there's new ones appearing. So, or they will go to a friend's place and see something there. So I think in a sense, this control and trying to regulate it through this is quite difficult. I think it's just establishing a sort of a talk and also a knowledge in your children that, you know, there's also dangerous things on the internet. The same way as you would tell them, don't get into cars with people you don't know. I mean, you know, there's also lies on the internet, and there's, you know, bad people on the internet trying to either, you know, sell you something or get your money, or, you know, or win you over for dangerous ideology.
Okay, so Sophie, we're approaching the limit.
Yes.
If I get it correctly, communication is definitely one of the ways of trying to prevent extremism.
And I think
you have chosen sorry?
Just one more thing. I think also if they use words or phrases suddenly that you just never heard before, I think you can also be a bit aware of this. You know, do they use, for example, the idea of a great replacement? That's sort of a very sort of new right term to describe that you know, immigrants are coming and threatening our European culture. So if you hear like words or you see symbols that you don't know that your kid is suddenly wearing or having somewhere, I think that's also something just to ask what this is and where they have it from. Sorry.
You should start talking, definitely, if you see things like that with your kids. You have chosen a difficult topic. I think you see and absorb a lot of stuff that some of us are trying to avoid, because this is often gruesome. It's terrorism. It's a matter of killing people and things like that. Are you still hopeful? Do you see us? Do you see Germany? Do you see us, humanity, being able to prevent repeating the same things that happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to be hopeful and to not have given up in a sense and just think, you know, I just go and watch Netflix and, you know, the screw the world. You know, I'll live in my own little bubble. And but I mean, at least in the German context, and it might again also be my little filter bubble maybe, but during the last year, especially also a bit with Black Lives Matter, I've seen things change. I think I've seen that in different places, the ways how we think about, you know, the awareness that racism is a problem. I think it has reached people that it hadn't reached before. I see, I think, yeah, a bit more diversity, more diverse people being represented, for example, in the public service channels in TV. A lot of or more, you know, diverse voices being heard, being invited to discussions. And also other sort of artistic interventions that sort of voice and give space to voices that have been marginalized so far. And I think, and maybe that's very sort of, you know, cheesy, but for example, I mean, seeing these Fridays for Futures kids, even though you don't hear much about them anymore, I do see a very sort of political generation. I do see children or teenagers who I think have understood how they can make their voice heard and that they need to raise their voices. I sometimes see on buses teenagers who seem to be much more, you know, open towards, you know, like certain gender fluidity, you know, gender roles not being, you know, super strict or predefined, or other sorts of diversity that are just part of their everyday lives and that they don't even question. So I think this is sort of the hope that things can be changing, and it will take a lot of time, but I don't think everything is lost yet.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you. There is hope then. It was Absolute pleasure. Vám všem, kteří jste se dívali, moc děkujeme. Doufáme, že to byl inspirativní obsah a přejeme hezký večer a loučíme se z Berlína a z Kodaně. Na viděnou.